Michael McKinnon, the sharp-suited mastermind. Patrick Doyle, the ruthless enforcer. Liam Fraser, the silent smuggler. Together they built Scotland's most feared criminal empire, a syndicate that ruled the streets with money, fear, and blood. Their story is not just about crime. It is about power, betrayal, and the rise and fall of a mafia that held a nation in its grip. Glasgow in the late 1980s was a city caught between its industrial past and an uncertain future. Shipyards and factories that had once roared with noise now stood silent, their windows shattered and their walls painted with graffiti. Men who had worked hard all their lives were suddenly without purpose, and young people grew restless in neighborhoods where opportunity had vanished. It was in these conditions that something dangerous began to take root, something that would change the face of Scotland's criminal underworld. Among the empty streets and broken buildings, a small group of men discovered that power could be taken by those bold enough to reach for it. What began as petty theft soon turned into an organized operation. Cars went missing from quiet suburbs, cigarettes were smuggled in from Europe, and alcohol appeared in pubs without ever passing through legal channels. At first, these crimes seemed small, the work of desperate men trying to survive. But survival quickly turned into ambition, and ambition into dominance. The group had a leader, a man who wore sharp suits and walked with the quiet confidence of someone who feared nothing. To the outside world, he appeared respectable, but in the hidden corners of Glasgow, his name carried weight like a shadow. He understood that fear was stronger than any weapon, and he used it well. Rivals who challenged him disappeared without explanation, their fates whispered about, but never proven. The police suspected his involvement, but no evidence could ever be tied to him. It was as if the city itself had swallowed those who stood in his way. The newspapers never mentioned his name, but in the pubs and dark alleys, he became a figure both respected and feared. Locals began calling the group the McKinnon Syndicate, though few dared to say it aloud. Their reputation grew in silence, carried on hushed conversations and knowing glances. As the syndicate expanded, their methods became more calculated. They no longer relied on brute force alone, but created networks of loyalty, using money to secure silence and intimidation to enforce obedience. They recruited carefully, choosing men who could follow orders without question and who understood the value of secrecy. Their business reached deeper into the city's veins, feeding off its desperation. They moved beyond stolen goods and smuggling, dipping into protection rackets that preyed on local shopkeepers. Owners paid not because they wanted to, but because they had seen what happened to those who refused. Broken windows, torched cars, and threats to family members ensured cooperation. It was a system built on fear, and it worked flawlessly. The streets of Glasgow began to change. Certain pubs became syndicate territory, and local markets operated under their watchful eye. Even the police seemed hesitant to push too hard, aware that anyone who spoke against the syndicate risked becoming the next name on the list of the missing. Yet the group did not thrive on violence alone. They built relationships, carefully blending into the very fabric of the communities they controlled. Charitable donations, neighborhood favors, and quiet assistance in times of need made them appear as protectors to some. Mothers struggling to feed their children might find envelopes of cash left at their door, never realizing that the same men who offered help were the ones flooding their neighborhoods with illegal goods. It was a dangerous game of deception, but it gave the syndicate something stronger than money: influence. What made them so terrifying was not just the crimes they committed, but the silence they created around themselves. No one dared to speak to the authorities, and those who considered it often vanished before they could act. The streets carried stories of bodies hidden in abandoned warehouses or dumped in the waters of the River Clyde. But without evidence, the police were powerless. Fear became an invisible wall that protected the syndicate more effectively than guns or knives ever could. It was this silence, this atmosphere of dread, that allowed them to grow unchecked. By the end of the decade, the McKinnon Syndicate had transformed from a small gang of opportunists into a powerful force that seemed untouchable. Their leader had become a ghostly figure whose presence was felt everywhere, yet rarely seen. Glasgow was no longer just a city struggling with unemployment and poverty. It was now the territory of a shadow empire, one that had risen not through chance, but through a ruthless understanding of human weakness. The syndicate had learned how to control fear, and with it, they controlled the city. The seeds of Scotland's crime mafia had been planted, and they were growing in the dark, ready to spread their roots far beyond the streets where they were born. By the mid-1990s, the McKinnon Syndicate had grown into something far larger than the small gang that once prowled the streets of Glasgow. Their operations stretched across Scotland, and their influence reached deep into the lives of ordinary people who often never realized they were brushing against the edges of organized crime. What had begun with smuggling and protection rackets now evolved into a complex empire, one built on drugs, money laundering, and control of legitimate businesses that masked darker dealings. Cocaine and heroin became their most profitable ventures, flooding into Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, and beyond. Shipments arrived through secret routes, slipping past customs of either been bribed or threatened into silence. Nightclubs became their playgrounds, where drugs circulated freely and where every dealer ultimately owed loyalty to the syndicate. The profits were staggering, and with wealth came power, the kind that no longer hid in the shadows but stood boldly in plain sight. The syndicate learned to wrap their criminal activities in layers of respectability. Construction firms linked to them won lucrative contracts, some by bribery, others by intimidation of competitors. Bars and restaurants were purchased outright, their cash-heavy operations serving as convenient fronts for laundering illegal profits. Even football stadiums were not untouched, as ticket scalping, merchandise sales, and betting schemes flowed through their networks. To the average citizen, these places looked like thriving businesses, but behind the scenes, every pound and every decision was carefully calculated to strengthen the syndicate's reach. They were no longer just criminals. They were businessmen, politicians, and silent partners in enterprises that shaped everyday life. But such visibility came with consequences. Journalists began whispering about a mafia operating in Scotland, weaving together stories of unexplained wealth, sudden acts of violence, and businessmen whose connections seemed too convenient to be honest. A few daring reporters tried to shine a light on the syndicate's activities, but their investigations often ended abruptly. Some faced threats that forced them to retreat, while others mysteriously found their careers collapsing after rumors and scandals suddenly surfaced about them. Whether through fear or manipulation, the syndicate always found a way to silence voices that came too close. The police, too, felt the growing pressure. Task forces were quietly formed, detectives spent long nights piecing together evidence, and surveillance teams tried to capture glimpses of the syndicate's inner workings. Yet time and again, cases fell apart. Witnesses who had sworn to testify recanted their statements, often after their families were visited by strangers. Files mysteriously went missing from police archives, and operations were leaked before they even began. It became clear that the syndicate's influence reached into law enforcement itself. A bribe here, a threat there, and the machinery of justice slowed to a crawl. For the ordinary citizen, it seemed as though the mafia had become untouchable, protected not only by violence, but by invisible strings that pulled at the very institutions meant to stop them. The true twist came when the syndicate stepped into politics. They understood that money could open doors that violence never could. Donations to local campaigns, pressure on influential figures, and quiet agreements with officials gave them allies in government. Some politicians accepted cash, others simply feared the consequences of saying no. This political shield allowed the syndicate to move with greater confidence, knowing that raids and arrests were less likely to strike at the heart of their empire. It was no longer just a gang controlling the streets. It was an empire controlling parts of the system itself. For Scotland, this was a dangerous new reality. Communities already struggling with unemployment and poverty now faced neighborhoods flooded with drugs, young men drawn into gangs, and families broken apart by addiction. Yet at the same time, the syndicate's leaders presented themselves as benefactors, sponsoring events, donating to charities, and appearing as respected businessmen in suits and ties. This dual identity made them harder to confront. To some, they were villains poisoning their communities. To others, they were saviors offering opportunities in places where the government had failed. The truth was that they were both, and it was this balance of fear and respect that made them stronger than ever. By the close of the decade, the McKinnon Syndicate was at its peak. Their wealth was immense, their power unchallenged, and their influence undeniable. They were no longer just a gang that people whispered about in pubs. They had become Scotland's silent rulers, shaping the lives of thousands while hiding their crimes beneath layers of respectability. For many, it seemed impossible that such an empire could ever be broken, and yet, beneath the surface, cracks were already beginning to form. Cracks that would one day bring the entire structure crashing down. Power has a way of creating enemies, and for the McKinnon Syndicate, the late 1990s marked the beginning of a dangerous unraveling. What had seemed like an unshakable empire began to weaken, not from outside attacks alone, but from the rot spreading within. The very men who had built their wealth on loyalty and silence found themselves at odds with one another. Jealousy grew among the younger members, who wanted their share of fortune faster and with less discipline. Older figures who had once been respected began flashing their wealth too openly, drawing attention that the syndicate had worked hard to avoid. In the hidden corners of Glasgow, people whispered that the syndicate was no longer a single family, but a fragile network held together by greed and fear. Rival groups took notice. From London came whispers of gangs hungry to carve into Scotland's market, while Irish networks in Dublin eyed the syndicate's grip on drug routes with growing interest. For years, no one had dared to challenge them, but now the cracks were visible, and predators circled like wolves around a wounded beast. It was not one grand attack that shook the syndicate, but a slow series of small cuts that weakened its hold. Suppliers began shifting their loyalty. Deals that had once flowed smoothly suddenly fell apart, and new rivals emerged on the streets. Violence surged, but this time it was not always aimed at outsiders. The real turning point came with a shipment of heroin valued at millions, a delivery that was supposed to secure the syndicate's dominance for years to come. Somewhere between the port and its hidden destination, the cargo vanished. At first, suspicion fell on rivals, but soon darker rumors began to spread. The theft had come from within. Fingers pointed at ambitious young members. Whispers suggested betrayal at the highest levels, and distrust poisoned the air. The syndicate had always survived on the strength of silence, but now silence turned against them. No one knew who could be trusted, and paranoia began to eat away at the bonds that had once made them strong. What followed was a storm of blood and fear. Men who had once shared drinks in the same bars now looked over their shoulders, knowing that one wrong move could mean death. Killings erupted not only on the streets of Glasgow, but in quiet suburbs and rural towns, where bodies were found in burned-out cars or left in shallow graves. Families of members lived in constant dread, never knowing when revenge would strike. The syndicate was collapsing from within, yet to the outside world, the violence only confirmed their reputation for cruelty. For the first time in years, law enforcement sensed opportunity. Detectives who had long struggled against silence began to see cracks they could exploit. Informants, once too terrified to speak, came forward in exchange for protection. Surveillance captured glimpses of heated meetings, intercepted conversations, and coded messages that hinted at deep divisions. Slowly, investigators began piecing together the truth. The syndicate's greatest threat was not the police, but themselves. Every betrayal created an opening. Every disappearance left behind evidence too hastily concealed. What had once been a fortress of discipline was now a battlefield of mistrust. The public began to notice as well. Once, the syndicate had managed to keep a veil of respectability, blending into society as businessmen and benefactors. But now the mask was slipping. News stories of shootings and unexplained explosions painted a picture of chaos rather than control. Ordinary citizens, who had once been too frightened to speak, started whispering to reporters, giving shape to the fear that had hung over communities for years. The myth of the untouchable mafia began to weaken, replaced by the image of men at war with one another. Still, the syndicate was not finished. Even as they tore themselves apart, their wealth and influence gave them tools to fight back. Police officers found themselves threatened, juries were tampered with, and politicians who had once taken donations now scrambled to distance themselves. Yet every desperate move only fueled the sense that the empire was unraveling. The organization that had risen from the shadows with such precision now stumbled openly, exposed by its own greed and betrayal. By the dawn of the new millennium, The McKinnon Syndicate stood at a crossroads. Its leaders were more paranoid than ever, its younger members more reckless, and its enemies more determined. The very empire that had once seemed unbreakable was crumbling, and with every passing month, the possibility of its collapse grew closer. The cracks in the empire were no longer hidden. They were spreading, tearing apart the foundations of Scotland's most feared mafia, and preparing the stage for the fall that was soon to come. In the early 2000s, Scotland awoke to headlines that few believed they would ever see. The McKinnon Syndicate, once thought untouchable, was finally being dragged into the light. Police raids struck in the dead of night, sweeping through Glasgow, Edinburgh, and smaller towns where the syndicate had quietly built their empire.